Okay, so Pokemon's been a series. It's been around for around 30 years, although technically if you want to go by 1995, that's be 25 years, because that's when it was officially released, but they didn't begin production until 1989, 1990. So about 30, 31 years. The series was also known as Kapu Monsters, and then later trademarked to Capsule Monsters, to Pocket Monsters, to eventually Pokemon as we know it. So, Pocket Monsters, Pokemon. So here's 10 things you probably didn't know about the series as a whole. So number 1 is Mew was the very first Pokemon that was trademarked. Now, this would make sense because the creator of Pokemon, also known as Satoshi Tajiri, I don't know which name goes first, Tajiri himself stated that Mew was his very favorite Pokemon. So it made sense that when you was going and trying to trademark like everything individually, they wanted to get Mew first because Mew was a Pokemon that really kind of stood out. And Mew being a big secret, hence the play on words, like, it's so rare that only a few people have ever seen it worldwide, ever. Okay, number 2, what you didn't know about Pokemon was that back in the day when Pokemon first came out, there was actual reasons to believe that Pikachu wasn't always the number 1 mascot. Now, you could argue Rhydon was technically the very first Pokemon that was ever drawn, and there's evidence of this. So there's evidence to believe that even Rhydon could have been the very first Pokemon. But as time went on, though, there was also known as a canceled Pokemon Pink, kind of like Pokemon Yellow. And it's debatable if it could have been Clefairy or Jigglypuff. Now, I think it would have been Clefairy, because if you didn't know this, even though this is pretty known by a lot of people by nowadays, Pokemon originally wasn't supposed to be 151. The Gen 1 wasn't. It was supposed to be around 200 when Gen 1 first came out. A lot of these Pokemon, it's still speculated which ones there are, but due to a leak that was from Nintendo, that this actually confirmed it. We had some kind of speculation of like what those Pokemon could have been. So, according to the real index numbers, Rhydon was the very first Pokemon, and somewhere, I think it was 6 or 7, was Clefairy. Clefairy back in the days of Kapumon, when they were still going through the first period cycle of the timeline of the Pokemon. Alright, so number 3 is Yu-Gi-Oh! Was actually inspired by Pokemon. And I'm going to tell you why. Because if you remember the anime Yu-Gi-Oh! Or King of Games, rather, there was one series of Yu-Gi-Oh! Called Capsule Monsters. And I guarantee you, if the research is correct, that they did it at the time when they realized that Nintendo or Game Freak pitched the idea, they trademarked it, and they were inspired to use the same thing, but then they had their own idea. Because I remember there was one PS1 game that was never released outside of Japan. I'm not sure if somebody even English translated it, where it was basically Capsule Monsters, kind of like a Capsule Monster Coliseum on the PS2, which was basically Capsule Monsters number 2 and Yu-Gi-Oh! The video games. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's where they got the idea from, was from Nintendo's Game Freak's, Capsule Monsters, Kapu Monsters. It'd be Japan's version. It'd be Konami's version, or the guy who owns Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I can never remember his name, actually. So that's pretty interesting to really look into, actually. Number 4 in the Pokemon trilogy would have to be that the first 2 generations, it's debatable, still widely debatable, if they were supposed to be just one game altogether. Although there's been reasons to believe that maybe the game designers would have eventually made sequels anyways. But from what we understand, though, Generation 1 and 2 were actually ran out of cartridge space for the games, and there were tons of ideas that were scrapped, not because they ran out of time and all that, but because of cartridge limitations, and because you couldn't just swap one cartridge and put another one in. You basically were just left with that one cartridge. From what I understand with the Game Boy, because I grew up with the Game Boy era, and and especially with the Game Boy Color era, you would be very surprised at what they could still do with those cartridges. But at the same time, though, just the amount of memory that they could only put in those games, and what basically we were able to see them do, which I thought was fascinating at the time. So it really raises the question, how much of this stuff is stored away in their servers, and eventually how much of that content was actually reused into something they wanted. Because at the same time, though, if we think about what Satoshi himself stated, that they were pretty happy with the way the games turned out, because they kind of had, like, most of the ideas that they had, they still finalized them the way they wanted to. So most of the Pokemon that we see were what they anticipated them to be, even in the beta format. So if that is true, then how many ideas were scrapped altogether? And maybe they were either just delayed, reworked into something else. I'll give you an example. If you look at the prototype 1997 Space World demo of Gen 2, there's some Pokemon that never made it outside of that game, ever. But then there were some of them that were flat out delayed. Let me give you an example. Leafeon. Leafeon was 251 in that game. Mind you, they couldn't go past 255, or at least they probably haven't figured out how to rewrite the columns so that way they could put more than 255 Pokemon, because the game would crash. Unless they stored it on a separate file, and then it just went up to 510 or something like that. 520. 1, 2, 3. No, 510. I'd have to double check. I'm not a programmer like some people are, but that is interesting though. So basically Leafeon was moved to Gen 4, but Gen 2, it should have been in Gen 2. Kind of makes you wonder though, because Celebi was eventually leaked, the prototype Celebi. Celebi was kind of like a brownish sort of, guardian of the forest. Still had its same role, but it was a little bit different at the time though. And then they redesigned it into a green pixie forest dwelling guardian, and it watched over the Idex forest. I'm trying to remember how you spell it. Was it Idex? Yeah, I think that's how you say it, Idex. But anyways, it just goes to show you though, like, Pokemon being a series about adventure and trying to figure out what the meaning of life is and all the things you don't see until you put yourself out there, it really does make you wonder, like, what they really had going for that series at the time. All right, so this one is probably the most interesting from what I've seen. Okay, so kind of like a continuation of the last one. There were hundreds, if not, we're talking like a lot of Pokemon were scrapped in Gen 2. Some of which, most of them, they probably never even, they weren't even found in the space demo because they weren't programmed all the way. But at the same time, though, how many concept designs and all that they scrapped because of cartridge limitations and reworked prototype maps and all that, and move sets that we probably don't see. I wouldn't be surprised if Game Freak still has like a book or something out there where they have like all these Pokemon ranging in the order they were drawn in from start to finish, like Gen 1. What were the Pokemon that were scrapped entirely and which ones? Like, because again, if you take the ones that we found, like in Gen 1, we know for a fact there was like 39, 40 of them that were scrapped. I think I got one of them figured out that wasn't released. It was a baby Kangaskhan. So yeah, you would have Cubone, baby Kangaskhan, Kangaskhan itself, Marowak, and then there was another Pokemon called Gardia, which Marowak evolved into. And it's just interesting to think like how they managed to write this in as a very significant portion of like how the series changed. Like I said, a lot of the ideas were finalized into what they wanted to, so that's a good sign. So we kind of have an idea of like that, okay, a lot of the ideas still made it into what they wanted to, but at the same time though, you still try to wonder, Pokemon being a series where they cut a lot of stuff because of cartridge limitations, makes you wonder if they really were serious about keeping some of these ideas. So maybe they have them backed up on a server somewhere that maybe we haven't seen yet, and we can still find them if possible. Okay, so going back to Gen 1's prototype, or at least some of the ideas that we had, there was a techno machine known as Jack. And what's really interesting is if you actually play F-Zero, the like GP Legend, the animated version of F-Zero, there's a character called Jack Robin, or no, Astro Robin's the ship he drives. It's Jack Levin. Jack Levin has the same hairstyle, but he's not a robot. He's a human being rather. And I think that's where they might have got it from, the concept for it, because Nintendo didn't use it in the Pokemon games. So some of it, it's interesting to think, like, you know, because F-Zero was a series that it was like one of the very first launch titles for some of the consoles. Like, you know, you had F-Zero on the Game Boy Advance, F-Zero on the Super Nintendo, F-Zero, you know, but some of them weren't released on like first right away. Some of them were like GP Legend wasn't one of the first games that was ever released, but it was released on the Game Boy Advance. And what's really interesting about it is while it followed the anime, there was also the sequel, F-Zero Climax for the Game Boy Advance, but it was Japanese only. And so you had like some of the characters in that game that were actually inspired by like something else that Nintendo actually might have done in their earlier days. So I'll show you like a screenshot comparison if you want to see it, but you can kind of see the idea, like where they might have got this from. And I just found this out a while ago, so I thought this was pretty cool. Okay, now this one was kind of another one that I've been thinking about for a while, but it's kind of a little bit of a rumor, but at the same time, here's some evidence to kind of back it up. Okay, so when Gen 1's prototype first came out, or some of the stuff that we got, there was 3 Pokemon that were never released. There was Katora, Raitora, and Gorotora. Gorotora. So basically, it's a lightning saber-toothed tiger. And this was supposed to be in Gen 1, but if you go to look at the 1997 Space World demo, there's only Katora and Raitora. But what's really interesting, though, is Gorotora is nowhere to be found. Now, it's very possible that maybe they just didn't design it into this game at this point, or maybe that's who knows what the final release was going to look like if they didn't rework the game. But this is what I'm thinking. If this is true, if you look at the concept art for the beta versions of Entei, Raikou, and Suicune, there is reasons to believe that they were completely different than what they looked like before. But what's really cool is I'm thinking that when Raikou was actually re-concept art, because he did it like 3 times, like, you know, he looked different in the 1997 Space World demo, he looked different in Gold and Silver, you play Pokemon Crystal, looks a lot different as well. I'm guessing that Gorotora might actually have been recycled into what Raikou was supposed to be, like, because Raikou is a saber-toothed electric tiger, even though it's supposed to be like a legendary dog. I wouldn't be surprised if that's where they got the idea from it, because if you look at some of the illustrations of it, its body looks a lot different. But then you have Raikou, who is kind of got like similar patterns on it, but again, a little bit different. And I wouldn't be surprised, again, Saber-Tooth Tiger from Gen 1 and Gen 2, and that was basically a Pokemon that was redesigned, so it's possible that they reused that design for that. So that's another one that's really interesting. Now, some people already know this, but I'm going to just kind of throw it out there anyways, because I thought this was really interesting, actually. At one point, there have been rumors that Pokemon X and Y for the 3DS was supposed to have a sequel. Kind of like, you know, like Pokemon Black and White 1 was a sequel, had a Pokemon Black and White 2 sequel, rather than just a remake of those games. And believe it or not, there was reason to believe this because there was actually a source code leaked for it that never got, like, before Pokemon Sun and Moon came out, Pokemon X and Y 2 were actually supposed to have sequels to each other. What that could have detailed and what Pokemon would have been in it, kind of a different story, but they probably moved on from it because they probably figured out that they were working on other projects at the time. And I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, I would be down if they actually remade those games, sort of. I would really like to see what they could have done with the Kalos region. If it was it the Kalos region or was it a different one? Oh no, I was thinking of Gen 5's. I can't remember the name now, but anyways, off the top of my head, but but like I said, if they would have made those sequels, how much different would they have been? You know, would they have fixed the things that a lot of people didn't like about Gen 6 at the time? Would they balance the difficulty out more? Would it have been would it have been more difficult than the first ones were? Because a lot of people were complaining about that. Although I feel like they could have made them more difficult, but at the same time, though, Pokemon games usually aren't that difficult to begin with. So, anyways, we move on to the next one. So just one of the many items that were scrapped from the Gen 2 prototype that never made it in was there was an unused evolutionary stone, also known as a poison stone, and you could probably guess it would have evolved like certain poison types into a Pokemon that would be stronger than its original form. So what kind of Pokemon can you think of that would require such a thing? Quite interesting to think about. You know, how many Pokemon were really truly scrapped from the unused versions of Gen 1 and 2, or even beyond that? Because once the game started jumping into the GBA, cartridge limitations weren't really that, it wasn't really that bad. So how much more content did they scrap? Very possible, but we still would have to figure out based on the builds of the game and how many evolutionary types might have been scrapped too. Is it also possible that maybe there could have been an unused Eevee evolution that could have evolved a poison stone at one time? Could you imagine having a poison type Eevee? And here's one that's really interesting that really probably wouldn't shock people, but you kind of forget about it over time because we're just not really used to thinking about it. So at one point, and even Nintendo's earliest time, they were thinking about, and even Game Freak too, was thinking about actually increasing the Pokemon total counter from 6 to roughly 10. So could you imagine Pokemon battles that would actually last even longer? Could you imagine having Pokemon battles where you'd be like a 10 on 10, and if they didn't scrap like triple battles and all that, maybe you could fight every single Pokemon at the same time if the game could handle such a thing. Or maybe like 4 on 4 or 5 on 5 rotation battles come back. Like, I mean, like you can think of all sorts of crazy things they could do if it wasn't just 6 on 6, you know. That'd be interesting. You know, how many Pokemon can you really up in a position like that? You know, the types you're up against, you never know what your opponent's going to use and all the tricks they have, you know, just infinite possibilities. That's what makes Pokemon like as interesting as it is, you know. So again, if you like this video, I will be making more of them when I find more information, but hopefully this is something you've learned something from this. That's why I made this video. I got a Patreon if you want to support this channel, support my work. I will be making more videos like this, like I said. If you aren't subscribed, please, because I want to help people out. I want people to know that I exist. So if we can achieve that goal, I will keep pushing out content. And I'll see you in the next episode. Hope you have a wonderful day.